Ladies and gentlemen, I have great pleasure in welcoming Mr. Kamath here this afternoon. As you all know, he is an alumnus of this institute, chairman of ICICI and chairman of Infosys. I don't think he needs any further introduction. It's an opportunity for us to be able to exchange some thoughts with him, and I shall now give the floor to him.
Thank you, Singania. Good evening. It's kind of embarrassing because this is a role reversal. I never thought I would ever be here talking to the teachers who made this institution possible and made me make myself possible in whatever little way I've been able to do over the last 40 years or so. I honestly mean it. I never expected that I would be speaking to this August gathering. And I remember that when I came back in '96, my first dose of mentoring, post my having graduated in 1971, was in a small group that C.K. Prahlad used to run every year. And he ran it almost till a couple of years back, just before he passed away, where he would he used shock and awe, in the sense that in '96, was the first time that I attended it. What he taught, or what he articulated, and what he put forth in front of you, to a small group of around 30 CEOs, I think put the foundation on what we see as the resurgence of Indian entrepreneurship in the period that followed. Resurgence may or may not be the right word. What I mean is the ability to look at the larger picture, because along with resurgence of entrepreneurship, we'll have to discuss several things, including some of the negatives, which I'm sure all of us have. I'm talking about the positive mindset. So, in a way, I started thereafter looking at a yearly rejuvenation exercise, where one was spend a few days when CK talked, and other was to try to see how obsolete I became every year, and try to maybe educate myself every year. But that was through diverse fora, since it need not have been a classroom right structure. It could have been completely different subjects to what I was exposed to, just to make sure that I did not get obsolete. I think that has stood me in good stead. So I think teaching that I had at this institute 40 years back, exposure to minds like C.K. Prahlad, and exposure to different fora probably helped me a little bit in my journey. What I will be speaking on today, and that's probably what I'll spend 2 or 3 minutes giving an outline and maybe engaging as you think necessary and fit, is on the changing India, in the sense that what has happened in the last few years in India is beyond at times comprehension. We saw China change, and we said, are we going to change as rapidly, or have we missed the bus? And we keep asking this question even today, and I want to put that in context in what I will be speaking. My hypothesis is that we have not missed the bus, and I will broadly demonstrate that. But some of the things that have happened just in a decade is remarkable. Because if you look back, it took us 22 years to be precise, to grow our GDP from $260 to, let's say, per capita income from $260 to a little over $500, just about $500. And thereafter, in the next decade, we doubled it once, and we are well on the way to now doubling it another time, once more. So clearly, in terms of the rapidity with change is happening, it is dramatic, and several things are driving this change, as we see. I think one is clearly the rise of the knowledge economy. I won't go into it. You all know what it was. It created the initial momentum. Then the rise of I would say, the manufacturing economy, a resurgence of manufacturing economy from where it was in a shambles in the 90s to a resurgent level in the 2000s, and we see now Indian companies with global aspirations clearly able to go out and hold their own in the marketplace. We then see the rise of technology in the last few years, and all these coalescing into one. Technology, I also mean communication technologies, and all these coalescing into one. As we see today, leveraging all this, leveraging the demographic advantage, a new momentum being built. And at every stage, what we said was not possible has been possible. I remember in 2004, we said, how can we grow at anything beyond 6% because our savings rate was 24%. But clearly, savings rate then grew into the high 30s, and 9% growth became possible. So every challenge we are in front of ourselves, we have been able to overcome. I remember going back a little further in time. 96, 97, there was a report. I think this was the Rakesh Mohan committee report, the first report on infrastructure, which raised a question: how will we invest 100,000 crores because we don't have the money? Correct question, because in 96 we didn't have 100,000 crores. Today you have individual companies with the investment plan significantly over 100,000 crores. So the whole thing has changed dramatically so in the last few years, and that pace is continuing. And when I correlate it to what we have seen of other transforming economies, going back, let us say 50, 60 years to Japan, that is the first one, probably is a good example to look at. You had Japan transform dramatically in the next 20, 25 years. Then you had the tiger economies, then you had Southeast Asia, then you had China, and China continues to happen. China has not stopped growing by any stretch. So continues to change, and now we have, I think, our turn, and I'm sure after us, we will have the turn of Africa, because we see momentum building up in Africa at this point in time. There are several things in addition to this transformation that has happened which are keeping us going. As I said, one is clearly technology, the demographic cut, as it were, and the rapidity of change in some of the things we see around us. To me, if I look at the future, what will drive it is probably the whole agenda of inclusion. I don't mean it again in a very narrow sense that inclusion means a few things. I mean the whole agenda of inclusion where you can leverage a variety of things to make it possible to change the lives of a large mass of people. Large mass of people we are talking is 700 million people. And that, in a variety of ways, if you look at the next agenda, and if we can drive it properly, I think would mean a whole lot of momentum going forward and a whole lot of good to our mass, as it were. And that, I think, is probably what drives the whole, or was driving a whole lot of things that the Prime Minister wanted to do. He has his own challenges, and some of it he couldn't drive, but some of it is getting driven on its own speed, as it were, and maybe small steps, some big steps taken by people to push it forward. So a variety of things are happening. My own assessment is that looking at on a comparative basis, looking at where we are and where China is, just so that we can use it as a proxy. I think we are about 7 or 8 years behind China. That is, to me, sometimes surprising, because if you look at the physical infrastructure, it appears as if you are way behind China, but actually, if you then go a little deeper, it doesn't look like we are more than 7 or 8 years behind China. And it probably was not possible for us to invest in infrastructure the way China has done and grow. Again, for a variety of reasons. But clearly, it's possible for us to keep pace as we go along and not let our people down. It's not a question of a race between China and us. It's, as I said, I was using it as a proxy to see where we could be. I think we would be able to grow. There are unfinished parts of the agenda. Clearly, health, reaching out, making sure that healthcare is available to every Indian. Education, making sure that it reaches every Indian. I think there are challenges that we will have to address as we go along. But that doesn't take away from the opportunities that are there and the opportunities that we can seize and push forward at this point in time. And very interestingly, in my observation over the last 15 years is that despite roadblocks, growth happens. And I would think that this time is no different. We know there are roadblocks, but growth continues to happen. Again, another observation I would make is that no major reform is really required to drive at this point in time. I think the major reforms that we needed were in the 90s, they have been done. A lot of clarification is required, a lot of, I would say, easing is required in terms of how we can push this agenda forward. But no, let me rephrase it, I don't think we need to go by a statement that we hear often that growth is stuck because of lack of reforms. I don't subscribe to that. I think enough has been done. Yes, more could be done in a few areas in terms of clarifications and so on. But we have enough steam to get going. And despite all the challenges, and we will not, I will not go into the challenges, we will grow at a fair nick. I always say that our growth has to be looked at in three contexts. What is the recorded growth, what is the uncounted growth, and what is the unaccounted growth. So we need to put these three in context and look at growth. And I think if you look at all these three, I think growth is at a fair pace. And I continue to be optimistic about the future. I'm going to stop here and, as Professor Barrow said, we could have an interaction. I leave it entirely to you. Thank you.
Anyone who would like to start us off?
What is your assessment of unaccounted growth? Do you think that in the last few years this has really been growing much faster than what it used to be earlier? And is that going to be a roadblock, or is that going to be something which anyway we were used to and so no issues at all?
Yeah. Actually, my assessment is that and this is assessment, and I'll use a simple proxy. A lot of things I use proxies because I find that's probably the only way you can have a better picture. I'm not saying true or better picture. So if, say in the year 2000 to 2003, I asked a builder and I asked a home buyer, how much black money are you paying to get an apartment, either in Delhi or in Bombay or wherever, I will get an answer as to what is the percentage, and I'll get a breakup of where all and what all is happening. And by 2003, it had come to a stage where, by and large, things were in white, recorded, accounted. The builder would say that, in some states there is still, I have to pay X per square feet for certain clearances and so on, but the rest of it is straightforward. There is no interference. And since manufacturing had been opened up, there was hardly any payments anywhere of a type of rent that we are talking of that was happening. I think what has happened now is when you talk to clients and customers, you get a different answer. There is no place where you can do business without rent being sought. And it has been then, the people with the ability to generate the largest rent, to pay that rent, to generate, to pay, are the ones who have grown significantly. I'll say this in a closed room. I won't make this statement outside, but it's very clear why this is happening. And one class which could grow rapidly was people who built, because that gave scope to generate a whole lot of things. Of course, they had to pay it out. That's their version of it, and probably true. But it started this negative cycle of this, and it pervaded across various things. And rent became, I think, synonymous with anything the government owned which had to be sold, and or a transaction where you could generate this sort of momentum, as it were, in this. Long answer, but I would think that if I look at all these things, probably about 1.5% is what is going on. And it has got its own growth momentum. So it's another pillar that has been built in terms of what is happening. You asked unaccounted. I will also count. I'll also put in the uncounted. Uncounted is because we don't have the data points. Our metrics are completely outdated. And this point, for 8-10 years, we have been trying to make to the government that our index of industrial production has to be recast. Nobody has still really done it. For example, probably there has been one revision since I started talking about it. The index has got textiles from the mill sector. The mill sector hardly produces anything. So it's the power loom sector. That's not counted. There is hardly any weightage for consumer electronics, consumer durable goods. Automobiles is a very low weightage, because all this was pre what has happened in the last 12 years. So we will need to reconstruct, as it were, the index to be able to measure. Then the touch points where you are collecting data. A whole lot of things can be actually now, end of the month, you have got statistics that come out from, say, Automobile Manufacturers Association, ready-made available to capture things. So traditional ways, and then using proxies, then using other sources of data, you can have a much more reliable database. Because I don't think anybody can believe that our growth and our industrial production will yo-yo the way it has been. Because one simple way to look at it is cross-check and see if that sort of variation took place. Was there then a sudden dip in, say, power consumption by industry? Otherwise, you can't correlate. It's a simple question. So we don't ask these questions, we don't cross-check. Again, I'm not pointing a finger at anybody, but this is the truth. And we need to, that's why I use proxies. And there again, the uncounted part is probably a 1% loss. So if the government says 7% for the year which will end this month, I would think we need to add another 1% plus 1%, 9%, a little over 9% maybe. For next year, they say 8.5%. We probably, at this time, we'll need to add. If there's a massive cleanup, then I think at least the unaccounted should start dropping.
I would share that you have that India is capable of a much larger growth rate than.
Yeah, go ahead. Oh, okay. Ms. Vijayavasinghani, yes. Here, I'll come back to you, please.
So you have opined that in the total MVPT equation, the unaccounted could be in the region of 1 to 1.5%. It was assumed that with greater constraints, regulations, rules, policies being opened up, liberalized, that the level of the second money, the cash money, would go down. It appears that in today's context, every field of activity is involved in very large numbers. You yourself said that what took 1 lakh crores in one time, now each company is willing to spend at that kind of rate. The value of money has gone down, inflation went up, because savings went up, investments went up. My argument is that from what appears, the cash component of the total MV supply has gone up, number one. And number two, I do strongly believe that the velocity of the unofficial money is considerably higher than the velocity of the official money. So I like to believe that the total component of MV on the PT has a very high component of cash for two reasons. Number one, the quantum, and number two, the velocity. And therefore, this is going to have a very major impact on the Indian economy.
Yeah.
One more, sir. A recent study of 176 countries showed India to be number 4 on the corruption index. A senior minister once told me, you should be happy. There are 3 more countries more corrupt than us. So we are not the most corrupt. In this kind of environment, where value system is destroyed, where integrity is destroyed, where you cannot plan a future, aren't you compelled to become dishonest? Aren't you compelled to think short term? Aren't you compelled to therefore take wrong decisions?
Yeah, I think very perceptual points. I agree with what you said. Luckily, maybe in terms of overall black or the unaccounted part of it, it is, as you said, high, and the velocity is higher there. But it's probably not at a level where it is derailing the economy, but it has the potential to derail the economy if this is not checked. And has thinking changed? Thinking does change, because if you can game the system, you will try to game the system, and that becomes an end to itself. Now that is again a very dangerous portent, because if you believe that you can game the system and progress, you will then start accumulating the tools to game the system. And one of the tools is money, which can change hands without it being accounted or being accountable. So that risk is there. Sometimes I feel these are all things that happen, and then something happens which changes the course, as it were, or the tide, as it were. And you may say, something happens. What is something? All I can think is, in our context, it is the democratic process which can change it. And in that process, if it can be demonstrated that people get re-elected only if they can provide a clean government and come out with clean hands, I think that is what is going to drive change. Again, being a democratic process, it is not instantaneous. It takes time, and we need to observe it over a period. So that's all that I can think of as what could correct it as we go along. But your points are well taken. You had a question? The mic.
While I share your optimism, I would also like to be informed, why is it that, let's say the banking industry and you as a doyen of the banking sector would not like to convince the central banker that indeed we are capable of a real growth in the range of 8.5%.
Yeah.
Because if so, I'm sure we would have been spared the huge demand side cuts on what many of us think is a supply side problem of inflation. Okay? So any light you could throw on this?
I think I entirely agree to the point that you have made, and I have to only submit that I've been incompetent in trying to convince them. This started with my very very old professor Rangarajan. I had the temerity to go to him in '96 and say that 20% interest rate in a situation where banks are borrowing from customers, we take deposits, yes, in a way that's a borrowing, but here you are going to established corporate and saying, do you have any surplus cash lying around, we need something to make ends meet, virtually saying that. And he threw me out of the room. He said, basically the refrain was very simple. Of course, he did it with a lot of tenderness, but effectively I was shown the door. And I have the same reception has continued ever since, because maybe rightly so. The problem, I think, with our policy, particularly in the banking context, has been that two hats that are worn. One is a monetary policy hat, and one is the banking regulator hat. So you can tighten the banks to actually implement policy. And sometimes when they say it or they explain it, their burden, they put it in this context that, ultimately we have to look after the interest of 1 billion people, and the worst thing that can happen to these 1 billion people is, inflation, which is at a runaway stage. So, given that, we don't mind growth being non-existent, but we need to make sure that inflation is controlled. Now, and of course, lots of times it has also been interspersed with what Delhi does in terms of profligacy. It's basically running a deficit which is very high. All valid reasons, but in today's context we see that a lot of theory that was written about inflation and deficits, not inflation, particularly on deficits, are not holding true. I think Western countries are happily having double-digit deficits. I'm not saying that we should have two, but if you then run a deficit which is, let's say, 5%, and there is a good component which goes towards, I would say, creation of infrastructure which has long-term returns, I think we can look at it in a different way. So again, in short, I buy what you say entirely, but I guess that they have their own constraints, and they have this fear of inflation which is paramount. And once you say that is so, and there is only one known cure for that, that's the second hypothesis, and that is keeping the interest rates high, then you don't find other solutions. As I said, I have different views, probably a different approach would be taken, but I don't have the burden of managing the policy. Yeah.
So the RTI was a defining moment in this country. And
Sorry?
then RTI was the defining moment in this country, and followed by 2G, maybe the coal scam and so on and so forth. What we are observing now is the bureaucrats are not taking any decisions. The protective shield they had earlier is actually gone off. And they're really struggling to take any bold decisions. Forget about even my struggling to take any policy or any changes. And how do you see how the governance is in this environment?
I think, again, it has to, the change has to come from the political masters. And the political masters clearly would need to take steps which are transparent and which can be defended, and then it flows. And there are several very interesting things that are happening. Today, if you talk to any client of, say, a bank, no state is willing to give land at anything but an current auction price, because they don't want to get into a situation where they have tomorrow to answer things which they may not have an answer for. So clearly it is starting to happen that you now are finding yourself accountable for things which earlier on you took a very bold decision and said, I'm talking of bona fide decisions, common good decisions, but today it's not, you're not taking these decisions. I think then that enables you to take a decision and move forward. But it is going to be slow, because every single activity that you do will have to be done on the basis that it is something that is defended, can be defensible. And as you said, this slowdown, just to put it in, to dramatize what you're saying, and maybe, actually I'm not right in saying dramatize, to put it in context, dramatic context would be better. There is, at this point in time, 25,000 megawatts of power generating capacity which is not fired. It has been set up during the last 3 years, and it is maybe 4 years, and it's now ready to be lit. 20,000 megawatts on coal and 5,000 megawatts on gas. No, because there is no coal or gas available. Because Coal India did not plan, they contracted, but they did not plan and they can't supply. The companies can import the coal and fire up these stations, but the cost is going to be probably at this point in time maybe 75% to 80% higher than what Coal India did. So, and almost all this capacity is contracted to be picked up by state electricity boards. Now, state electricity boards may have a problem of their own, we will look at it separately, but the point is nobody is willing to take a decision that this contract has now to be renegotiated. Otherwise, these companies will never fire, because the day they start operations, they virtually then are signing their warrant, as it were, because they can't sustain themselves. So this has to be looked at as a national challenge, and you have to sit together and resolve it. I think after this capacity has been created and now that it is idle, I think the Prime Minister's office has said they will sit together and do it. Now, at this point of time, they are sitting together to resolve the coal supply issue. But as I said, till you resolve the issue of offtake and what price offtake, the power offtake agreements, this is going to be a partial solution which probably will fail. So it is affecting, as you said, small decisions to things of national importance. And to again put 25,000 megawatts into context, 25,000 megawatts is 125,000 crores, $25 billion of investment stuck. And you can see the chain reaction this would have, because let's just assume that the final 10 or 20% of these contracts is not paid. And typically this would be a range of manufacturers, including ancillaries. Everybody is stuck. So that's what's causing systemic, I would say, tightness also. So all these things need to be addressed. Again, democratic process, things won't happen quickly. That's my fear.
Sort of two related questions. One is, this refers to your statement on the next agenda would be the agenda of inclusion. So if you look at sort of, some of the data that's there on compensation to workers versus non-workers over the last decade, you see basically for workers it's been almost flat in terms of real wages, real compensation, and for non-workers it's obviously increased by at least 20-30 percentage points. So the first question, I guess, is a little rhetoric, but how far are we away from Occupy Dalal Street? So a lot of angst today is against the government. You have the Jantar Mantar and all of that. How far are we away from an angst against Dalal Street and the industry in general? The second related question is, you've been a student here. You've been, you are a chairman of a company that sort of hires MBAs, graduates of ours. What role do you see from that perspective of an institute like ours in contributing towards this agenda of inclusion in terms of either what students go through, what the orientation of the institute lies?
Yeah, I think first question, Occupy Dalal Street. See, two things I think are required here. If you look at the West, and then we look at ourselves. I look at ourselves. West in say just a minute, take 1 minute look at it. I guess that this whole feeling of the government has not done enough for us, or we have been unfairly treated is so huge. When we look at it from the Indian perspective, it doesn't appear to be so. For example, you take a slightly different case, which is equivalent to Occupy Wall Street. It is Occupy the Streets in Greece, where you want the right to retire at 50. And you want the right to retire at 50, even if you, let's say, and apparently at 50 you retire if you are in a hazardous profession. And hairdressers say they are in a hazardous profession because they use dyes which have ammonia. So you are in a hazardous profession and retire at 50. So in the West, if I take this example, things have gone to the extreme. Our case is different. That's the point that I am making. What I fear is, I have no clear answer to how far we are. But I can say this, that if the politicians trigger it, it could happen tomorrow. And it could not just occupy Dalal Street, it could be occupy more things. In the sense, if it is decided that you will permit in a way emotions to be stoked, you could have repercussions which you then can't control. This is the view that I have. So for a country or for any transforming economy, it takes time for change to reach out to everybody. And I am not using the word trickle down. It actually reaches out at a pace which we could be pleasantly surprised. And the disruptive change that is happening at a faster pace from what we have observed, say in Bihar and in some of the backward states, and some of the states which are at slightly progressed level. So if the government is able to provide good governance and make sure that things are on an even keel, change does happen, and it reaches the mass. So that part of it, I think. Earlier on, I think the challenge was that you did not have the ability to actually take some of the tools that are required for everybody to benefit from this change to the mass. And now I think those tools are available. So if we don't take it now, we have no excuse. We will then have to say that we did not do the right thing, because all the things that are necessary to provide access to a variety of things to the poor are now in place. In terms of the wage context, this will probably be something that can always be debated, and as I was taught at the institute, there probably will be no right or wrong answer. It is how you argue the case and your thought process that matters. If you look at the whole issue of farm wages following Narega, there has been a spike, and it has in a way reset the wage structure in the rural end. There are critics and there are people who say it's good. I actually am on the side of it did a good thing, in the sense again, I have enormous respect for the Prime Minister, and if this was his idea, it is he probably thought it through as to what could be the consequences and then pushed it through. The fact is, if you talk to several other people who pay those wages, they will not agree with me. So I guess that steps have been taken which will do the correction, but the Occupy Dalal Street type of challenge is a real challenge, and probably we should make sure that it doesn't get stoked because of political end to it. What can the institute do to prepare our young leaders? Having gone through the process myself and seeing the intake in the last 10-15 years, what is probably the single most important thing that we need for the country and for preparing a product which is world class is for this product to be current. So whatever is current in the context of what is happening around us in the country and what is happening around us in the world, if that knowledge can be made, the student can be made aware of that knowledge and imbibes that as he comes out into the workplace, I think it would be a tremendous plus for the whole process. So it spans a whole lot of things. It probably a whole lot of debate on right to information, a whole lot of debate on the Lokpal type of situation. I'm not saying the Lokpal bill as argued by Anna Hazare, but the Lokpal type of situation as to what are the pros and cons in a democratic process. Is this just a stopgap arrangement that you're thinking of, rather than actually setting the governance process right? A whole lot of questions that can be asked, probably need to be asked in this context. And this, if a young graduate has got, postgraduate has got full knowledge of, becomes a big plus. The other big plus in driving the inclusive agenda, in my mind, is going to be the technology bit, in the sense that his ability to, or her ability to manage technology, it's evolving. There, having said that, I think life is a little bit easier, because the student of today, by rote, is coming up to speed on technology. So it becomes interesting. Third bit, probably, which I do not know to what extent we really teach or engage with. I think we probably will benefit a lot from exposing students to what I would call the societal context. You in a society and what happens, and try to build that in, because I find people are not exposed to this. We weren't exposed to this, and are not exposed to this, and this is something probably will be enormously useful in the context of at least our nation.
Sir, this relates to something on the of the next decade or so, that you're saying it's our turn after the China and in spite of whatever is happening. But I want to have your view, rather ask you, that as a senior banker, it's very important to have this, foreign investment, cross-border transactions. And when the apex court is giving a judgment on a case like Vodafone, and down the road 1 month the finance minister puts something retrospectively from 1962, where is the credibility and how can it affect the cross-border capital account transactions?
Yeah, I think it's very, very important point. I'm not very sure what is in the minds of the tax authorities when they have made it retrospective. There must be something in the mind which I'm at this stage not able to read. But having read what is there in the public domain, my feeling is the same as yours. This probably will be viewed as hugely negative. Having said that, there are any number of foreign companies that are operating here which have no fears on this count at all. So again, I think it comes to, I can give you a broad scenario how I expect discussions to happen in global boardrooms. They will dissect this, and they will look at it, and they will also look at, say, the 99.5% of global companies which are operating in India without any problem at all, and then come to probably a conclusion that this is something that people who have gamed the system or are seen to have gamed the system, in their minds they may not have gamed the system, are going to suffer. And if we are clear that we are not gamed the system, we don't have anything to worry. So India ought to be looked at. Stop there and then say, when we look at India, if India is a 10% growth story, then it is a risk worth taking. But without trying to do anything which could tomorrow throw us into trouble. So they will look at the context more closely and then proceed. And I am sure there will be extreme caution in areas like, in areas where there are government auction rights and so on. So they will, in the typical context, make an analysis of, what is, a risk that they could take and what is a risk that they will probably shy away from, and then take the decision. The 10% growth for the next 10, 15, 2 decades, let's say, 1 billion people is too attractive not to do business in an ethical, proper manner with all governance things step in. I would think that they would be more worried actually if corruption is not under control. That is something that they would be more worried. That particularly in the context of Western companies, if they would see anything as triggering the FCPA in their countries, they would, or because they are operating in certain domains where this is practiced, that is where they would be worried about. But not on this count as much as we believe it could be.
If I may ask a question squarely in your domain, if you look at the 2 decades from 1980 to 2000, great companies like ICICI, Infosys and others were created, which not only created benchmarks in India but also globally. But it seems that in the last 10 years, that process has slowed down. You don't see the emergence of new and innovative companies like the 2, for example, that you've been most closely associated with. Any thoughts on that? It would be very interesting.
Very interesting question. Very interesting question. I think, again, if you look at the wealth creators, and if you take what you presented over a period, at least I looked at it over 80s, 90s, the 2000s, you see different type of companies being wealth creators. And what we see is that in the period that you mentioned, people who could read technology and people who could, in a way, read opportunity that India was providing, I think became game-changing companies. And there will be several of them. In the last 10 years, it is people who could read the opportunity in access to anything that the government was selling. I think created wealth at such a rapid pace that there is a rat race for that. Again, rat probably is not a right word to use, but there is a race for it. So this is what I think has happened. And as a cleanup now happens, I think we will see this change in the next decade. I see manufacturing companies coming to the forefront next 10 years for a very simple reason, that today, we always had 1 billion people, or the last decade or decade and a half. But we did not have 1 billion people with purchasing power. We now have 1 billion people with aspirations and purchasing power, which then drives the opportunity. And you look at a company like Bajaj Auto, a first-class company, absolutely great in terms of what they do in R&D, in executing their projects, and in making a product, and the value for money product. Last year's profit is something like 3,500 crores. That's not a small sum for a two-wheeler manufacturer. In the context of looking at the larger, suddenly you see manufacturing companies come to scale in terms of profit. They never did in terms of profit earlier. And market cap follows thereafter, and valuation follows. And if you then are growing at the pace the market expects, what your market allows and the capital market expects, I would say the growth cycle is in your favor, and that's what I see. Of course, Tata Motors is another example. We can talk of several examples. I see these companies emerging, and you'll also see companies probably which can leverage technology, because the rapidity with technology is again changing. I think will throw up opportunities. So we had a flush of rights and entitlement companies. I think that rush is over. We had during the decade also, if you go back, a rush of property companies where the hype probably grew at a faster pace than fundamentals, and they have been corrected. I think the mineral companies will probably go through that sort of a correction, and then you will see a new class of companies in the period 2010, 2020. Beyond 2020, maybe another cycle. Thank you.
Yeah, I think we need to bring this session to a close. On behalf of all of us, I would like to thank Mr. Kamath for a wonderful session of Q&A. Let's give him a big hand.
Thank you.